The emaciated girl trembled as she cradled the wounded dog, a last shred of hope in a world that had abandoned them both. In that moment of desperate connection, neither could have imagined how their lives were about to change forever. The acrid smell of exhaust fumes mingled with the enticing aroma of street food as Zoe weaved her way through the bustling downtown streets of Chicago. At 12 years old, she moved with the practiced ease of someone far beyond her years, her small frame darting between distracted pedestrians and impatient taxi drivers. The cacophony of car horns, snippets of conversation, and the distant wail of sirens created a familiar urban symphony that had become the backdrop to her daily struggle for survival. Zoe's appearance told the story of a child living on the fringes of society. Her once vibrant sneakers were now scuffed and worn, the soles threatening to separate with each determined step. Her jeans, a size too small, were patched at the knees, a clumsy but earnest attempt at extending their lifespan. The oversized hoodie she wore, a relic from her past life, hung from her thin frame like a shield against the world's prying eyes. As she navigated the crowded sidewalks, Zoe's gaze remained alert, constantly scanning her surroundings. It wasn't just habit, it was necessity. 2 years on the streets had taught her that opportunity and danger could lurk around any corner. Her eyes, a striking hazel that hinted at a spark not yet extinguished by hardship, darted from face to face, assessing potential threats or allies in milliseconds. The towering skyscrapers that dominated the skyline seemed to mock her with their gleaming windows and promises of warmth and security. Zoe allowed herself a moment to imagine what life might be like inside those steel and glass monoliths. The thought was fleeting. She couldn't afford such indulgences. Reality demanded her full attention. As the day wore on and the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the urban landscape, Zoe made her way towards a small park tucked between two office buildings. It was here, amidst the carefully manicured flower beds and strategically placed benches, that she often found a moment's respite from the relentless pace of street life. Settling onto a bench, Zoe reached into her battered backpack, her sole possession of any worth, and pulled out a slightly squashed sandwich. It was the result of her morning's work, a payment of sorts from the kind-hearted owner of a local deli, who turned a blind eye to child labor laws in exchange for Zoe's help with early morning deliveries. As she ate, savoring each bite with the appreciation of one who knew true hunger, Zoe observed the park's other occupants. Suited businessmen and women hurried through, their eyes glued to smartphones, oblivious to the world around them. A group of tourists huddled around a map, arguing good-naturedly about their next destination. And there, near the fountain, a young couple sat close together, lost in each other's eyes. Zoe felt a familiar pang in her chest. It wasn't quite jealousy. She had long since learned that such emotions were luxuries she couldn't afford. Rather, it was a deep, aching sense of longing for something she had lost and feared she might never regain. Connection, belonging, love. Her reverie was interrupted by a commotion near the park's entrance. Raised voices and the sound of scrambling paws drew her attention. A group of teenagers, their laughter tinged with cruelty, were taunting a dog, a golden retriever by the looks of it, though its coat was matted and dirty. The animal cowered, tail tucked between its legs, as the boys took turns lunging at it, clearly enjoying the fear they instilled. For a moment, Zoe hesitated. Every instinct honed by years on the street screamed at her to mind her own business, to not draw attention to herself. But something stirred within her, a memory perhaps of a time when she too had known kindness and protection. Before she could second-guess herself, Zoe was on her feet, her half-eaten sandwich forgotten on the bench. She approached the group, her heart pounding but her voice steady as she called out, "Hey, leave him alone." The teenagers turned, momentarily surprised by the interruption. The tallest of the group, a lanky boy with a shock of red hair, sneered at Zoe. "Mind your own business, street rat. This mutt's probably as worthless as you are." His words stung, but Zoe stood her ground. "He's not hurting anyone. Just let him go." The redhead's eyes narrowed, a dangerous glint appearing. "And what are you going to do about it if we don't?" It was a challenge, one that Zoe knew could end badly for her. But as her gaze met that of the terrified dog, she felt a surge of protectiveness that overrode her caution. I'll report you. Animal cruelty is a crime, you know? The threat, empty as it was, seemed to give the boys pause. They exchanged glances, weighing the fun of tormenting the dog against the potential consequences. After a tense moment, the redhead shrugged. Whatever, it's just a dumb dog anyway. With a final kick that sent the golden retriever yelping, the group sauntered away, their laughter echoing in the park. Zoe waited until they were out of sight before approaching the trembling animal. "Hey there," she said softly, crouching down to appear less threatening. "It's okay. They're gone now." The dog regarded her warily, its brown eyes filled with a mixture of fear and exhaustion that Zoe recognized all too well. Slowly, she extended her hand, allowing the animal to catch her scent. "I'm not going to hurt you," she murmured. "Promise." After what seemed like an eternity, the dog inched forward, its nose twitching as it sniffed Zoe's outstretched fingers. Then, with a small whine, it pressed its head against her hand. The simple gesture of trust nearly undid Zoe. She felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes as she gently stroked the dog's matted fur. "You're okay," she whispered, as much to herself as to the animal. "We're okay." As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the park in twilight hues, Zoe found herself faced with a dilemma. She couldn't leave the dog here, vulnerable to more cruelty or the dangers of city streets at night. But taking on the responsibility of another life, when she could barely care for herself, seemed impossible. Yet, as she looked into the dog's eyes, Zoe saw a reflection of her own loneliness and need for companionship. In that moment, she made a decision that would alter the course of her life in ways she couldn't yet imagine. "Come on, boy," she said, her voice filled with a determination she didn't entirely feel. "Let's get out of here." The dog, as if understanding the lifeline being offered, struggled to its feet. It was then that Zoe noticed a limp. One of its front paws was held gingerly off the ground. The sight steeled her resolve. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she couldn't abandon this creature to face them alone. As they made their way out of the park, an odd pair united by circumstance and compassion, Zoe's mind raced with the practicalities of her impulsive decision. Food, shelter, medical care, all things she struggled to secure for herself, let alone a four-legged companion. But with each limping step the dog took by her side, she felt a growing sense of purpose that had been absent from her life for far too long. The streets of Chicago, which had always seemed indifferent to Zoe's plight, now took on a new aspect. Every alley could be a potential shelter, every dumpster a possible source of food. She found herself seeing the city through the eyes of her new companion, alert to both dangers and opportunities she had never considered before. As they walked, Zoe talked softly to the dog, her voice a soothing murmur in the growing darkness. "I guess we both need names, huh? Can't keep calling you boy forever." She pondered for a moment, then smiled. "How about Max? You look like a Max to me." The dog's ears perked up at the sound, and Zoe took it as agreement. "Max it is then. I'm Zoe, by the way. Though I guess you can't exactly call me that, can you?" Their progress was slow, hampered by Max's injury and Zoe's need to remain vigilant. The nighttime streets of Chicago were no place for a young girl and a wounded dog, but Zoe's street smarts guided them through back alleys and less traveled paths. As they walked, Zoe's mind drifted to the past, to memories of a life that seemed increasingly like a dream. She remembered a home filled with warmth and laughter, parents who tucked her in at night and promised to always keep her safe. The accident that took them from her had shattered that world, leaving Zoe adrift in a system too overwhelmed to truly care for one more lost child. The sound of Max's labored breathing brought Zoe back to the present. She realized they needed to find shelter soon. The night air was growing chill, and Max's condition worried her. "Just a little further," she encouraged, though she had no real destination in mind. It was then, as if fate had decided to throw them a lifeline, that Zoe spotted a flicker of light from a partially open door in a nearby alley. Approaching cautiously, she saw it was the back entrance to what appeared to be a veterinary clinic. A middle-aged woman in scrubs was just stepping out, a bag of trash in her hand. Zoe hesitated, years of distrust warring with desperate need. But as Max whimpered softly beside her, she made her choice. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice smaller than she intended. "Can you help us?" "He's hurt." The woman turned, startled by the unexpected voice in the darkness. Her eyes widened as she took in the sight before her, a young girl, clearly homeless, standing protectively next to a bedraggled golden retriever. For a moment, no one moved. Then, with a kindness Zoe had almost forgotten existed, the woman smiled. "Of course," she said, her voice warm and reassuring. "Come on in, both of you. Let's see what we can do." As Zoe guided Max towards the open door, she felt a glimmer of something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she was no longer facing them alone. With Max by her side and the unexpected kindness of a stranger, Zoe stepped into the warmth of the clinic, leaving the cold indifference of the streets behind, if only for a moment. The door closed behind them, shutting out the night and opening a new chapter in Zoe's life, one that would test her resilience, challenge her perceptions, and ultimately show her the transformative power of compassion, both given and received. As Zoe and Max stepped into the warm glow of the veterinary clinic, the stark contrast to the cold, unforgiving streets outside was immediately apparent. The antiseptic smell, so different from the urban odors they were accustomed to, filled their nostrils. Zoe blinked, her eyes adjusting to the bright fluorescent lights that illuminated a small, tidy waiting room. The woman in scrubs, who had introduced herself as Dr. Olivia Chen, gently ushered them towards an examination room. "Let's take a look at your friend here," she said, her voice calm and reassuring. Zoe nodded, her hand resting protectively on Max's head as they followed. Inside the exam room, Dr. Chen patted the metal table. "Can you help him up here?" she asked Zoe. With some coaxing and careful maneuvering, they managed to lift Max onto the table. The dog whimpered softly, his trust in Zoe evident as he looked to her for reassurance. As Dr. Chen began her examination, Zoe found herself studying the veterinarian. Dr. Chen's face was kind, with laugh lines around her eyes that spoke of a life filled with joy despite the challenges her profession must bring. Her movements were gentle, yet confident, as she checked Max's vital signs and examined his injured paw. "So, Dr. Chen said casually as she worked, "Want to tell me how you two found each other?" Zoe hesitated, years of learned caution making her wary of sharing too much. But something about Dr. Chen's demeanor put her at ease. "I found him in the park," she said quietly. "Some kids were hurting him. I couldn't just leave him there." Dr. Chen nodded, her eyes softening with understanding. "That was very brave of you," she said, her tone free of the condescension Zoe had come to expect from adults. "Max here is lucky to have found a friend like you." The use of the name Zoe had given the dog didn't escape her notice. It was a small thing, but it made her feel seen in a way she hadn't in a long time. She watched as Dr. Chen carefully cleaned and bandaged Max's paw, explaining each step of the process. "It looks like a sprain, Doctor," Chen said finally. "He'll need to rest it for a few days, but with proper care, he should recover fully." She paused, her eyes meeting Zoe's. "Do you have a safe place to take him?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. Zoe felt her chest tighten, the reality of her situation crashing back upon her. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Dr. Chen seemed to read the answer in Zoe's silence. "I see," she said softly. Then, after a moment's consideration, "How would you like to stay here tonight? We have a small break room with a couch. It's not much, but it's warm and safe." Zoe's eyes widened in surprise. "Really? You'd let us stay?" Dr. Chen smiled. "Of course. I can in good conscience send you both back out there, especially with Max injured. We'll figure something out in the morning." The kindness of the offer nearly overwhelmed Zoe. She nodded, not trusting her voice to remain steady if she spoke. As Dr. Chen led them to the break room, Zoe's mind raced with questions and uncertainties. What would happen in the morning? Would Dr. Chen call social services? The thought made Zoe's heart race with anxiety. She had run from foster homes before, unable to bear the impersonal nature of the system that was supposed to care for her. The break room was small but cozy, with a worn leather couch that looked infinitely more comfortable than any place Zoe had slept in months. Dr. Chun brought in some blankets and a pillow, as well as a bowl of water and some food for Max. "Try to get some rest," Dr. Chun said. "I'll be here early in the morning. We can talk more then." As the door closed behind the veterinarian, Zoe found herself alone with Max for the first time since their encounter in the park. The dog looked up at her with trusting eyes, his tail wagging weakly. Zoe sank down onto the couch, the events of the day finally catching up with her. "Looks like we both got lucky today, huh, Max?" she murmured, running her hand gently through his fur. Max responded by laying his head on her lap, a gesture of trust that brought unexpected tears to Zoe's eyes. As the night deepened, Zoe lay on the couch with Max curled up beside her. The rhythmic sound of his breathing was comforting, a reminder that she wasn't alone. For the first time in years, Zoe allowed herself to relax fully, feeling safe in the warmth of the clinic and the presence of her new companion. Her thoughts drifted to her parents, to the life she had lost. The memories were bittersweet, tinged with the ache of absence, but also with a newfound appreciation for the love they had given her. Zoe realized that in saving Max, she had reconnected with a part of herself she thought was lost, the part that could care, that could make a difference. As sleep began to claim her, Zoe made a silent promise to herself and to Max. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. With this resolution, she drifted off into the most peaceful sleep she had experienced in years. The morning light filtering through the small window of the break room roused Zoe from her slumber. For a moment, disoriented by the unfamiliar surroundings, she tensed. Then the events of the previous day came flooding back as she felt Max's warm presence beside her. Sitting up slowly, careful not to disturb the still sleeping dog, Zoe took stock of their situation. The reality of their precarious position hit her anew. What would happen now? Could she trust Dr. Chen, or would the kindly veterinarian feel obligated to report her to the authorities? The sound of the clinic's front door opening interrupted her thoughts. Footsteps approached, and then a gentle knock on the break room door. "Zoe, are you awake?" Dr. Chen's voice called softly. Taking a deep breath to steel herself, Zoe responded, "Yes, we're up." Dr. Chen entered, carrying a paper bag that emitted the tantalizing aroma of fresh pastries. "I thought you might be hungry," she said, setting the bag down on a small table. "How did you both sleep?" "Good," Zoe replied, surprised to realize it was true. "Thank you for letting us stay." As they shared the breakfast Dr. Chen had brought, Zoe found herself opening up bit by bit. She told Dr. Chen about losing her parents, about the foster homes that never felt like home, and about her decision to strike out on her own rather than remain in a system that seemed to have forgotten her. Dr. Chen listened without judgment, her eyes full of compassion. When Zoe finished, the veterinarian was quiet for a moment before speaking. "Zoe, what you've been through, no child should have to endure that. But I want you to know that you're not alone anymore." The words, spoken with such sincerity, pierced through the wall Zoe had built around her heart. "What's going to happen now?" she asked, voicing the fear that had been gnawing at her since the night before. Dr. Chen sighed. "Legally, I should report this to Child Services," she began, and Zoe felt her heart sink. But then, the veterinarian continued, "However, I think we might be able to find a better solution, one that keeps you and Max together." Hope, fragile but persistent, bloomed in Zoe's chest. "Really? How?" "I have a friend," Dr. Chen explained. "His name is Jake Thompson. He's a professional dog trainer who works with therapy animals. I think he might be able to help us figure something out. Would you be willing to meet him?" Zoe hesitated, her instinct to distrust warring with her desperate need for help. She looked down at Max, who gazed back at her with complete trust. If she could open her heart to this dog, perhaps she could take a chance on the kindness of these adults who seemed genuinely interested in helping her. "Okay," she said finally. "I'll meet him." Dr. Chen smiled. "Wonderful. I'll give him a call. In the meantime, why don't we get Max here checked out again? And maybe we can find you some clean clothes and a chance to freshen up." As the morning progressed, Zoe found herself swept up in a whirlwind of activity. Dr. Chun's assistant arrived, expressing only mild surprise at finding a young girl and a golden retriever making themselves at home in the clinic. While Dr. Chun made calls, the assistant helped Zoe give Max a much-needed bath, the dog's true golden coat emerging from beneath the dirt and grime. Zoe, too, was given the opportunity to shower and change into clean clothes, donated items kept at the clinic for emergencies. As she looked at herself in the mirror, hair damp and wearing a soft, clean sweater, Zoe barely recognized the girl staring back at her. For the first time in months, she looked like a normal 12-year-old, not a hardened street kid. It was nearing noon when the clinic's door chimed, announcing a new arrival. Zoe tensed, instinctively moving closer to Max. Dr. Chun emerged from her office, greeting the newcomer warmly. "Jake, thank you for coming on such short notice," she said, leading a tall, broad-shouldered man with kind eyes and salt and pepper hair into the room where Zoe and Max waited. Jake Thompson's gaze immediately went to the odd pair, the young girl and the golden retriever sitting side by side, both looking at him with a mixture of wariness and hope. His face softened into a gentle smile. "Well," he said, his voice warm and reassuring, "it looks like we have quite the dynamic duo here. Mind if I say hello?" As Jake Thompson approached, Zoe instinctively placed a protective hand on Max's head. The dog, sensing her unease, pressed closer to her side. Jake noticed the subtle interaction and slowed his approach, crouching down to their level a few feet away. "Hi there," he said softly, addressing both Zoe and Max. "I'm Jake. Doctor Chun tells me you two have had quite an adventure." Zoe remained silent, studying the man before her. His posture was open and non-threatening, and there was a gentleness in his eyes that reminded her of the way her father used to look at her. Still, years on the street had taught her caution. Jake didn't seem bothered by her silence. Instead, he turned his attention to Max, speaking in a low, soothing tone. "And you must be Max. Mind if I take a look at you, buddy?" To Zoe's surprise, Max's tail gave a tentative wag. Jake smiled, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a small treat. He held it out, not to Max, but to Zoe. "Would you like to give this to him?" he asked. The simple act of putting her in control of the situation eased some of Zoe's tension. She took the treat and offered it to Max, who accepted it gently. As the dog munched happily, Jake began to talk, his voice calm and steady. "You know, I work with dogs like Max all the time," he said. "Dogs that have been through tough times, just like you two. And do you know what I've learned?" He paused, waiting until Zoe met his gaze. "I've learned that dogs and people aren't so different. We all need love, safety, and a chance to show what we're capable of." Something in his words resonated with Zoe. For the first time since he'd entered the room, she spoke. "What do you mean?" Jake's eyes lit up at her question. "Well, take Max here. He's been through something scary, right? But with a little care and trust, he's already showing his true self. Dogs have an amazing capacity for forgiveness and love. They teach us humans a lot about resilience." As he spoke, Jake slowly moved closer, allowing Max to sniff his hand. The dog's tail wagged more confidently now, and he even licked Jake's fingers, eliciting a laugh from the trainer. "See that?" Jake said, grinning at Zoe. "Max here is a natural. I bet with a little training, he could be an amazing therapy dog." Zoe's eyes widened. "A therapy dog? What's that?" Jake launched into an explanation, his passion for his work evident in every word. He told Zoe about how dogs like Max could be trained to provide comfort and support to people in hospitals, nursing homes, and even schools. As he spoke, Zoe found herself leaning in, captivated by the possibility of a world where she and Max could make a difference. "The thing is," Jake continued, his tone becoming more serious, "training a therapy dog takes time and resources. It's not something that can be done on the streets." Zoe felt her heart sink. Of course, there was a catch. There always was. But Jake wasn't finished. "That's why I have a proposition for you, Zoe. For both of you, actually." He glanced at Dr. Chun, who nodded encouraging. "How would you feel about coming to stay with me for a while? I have a training facility with living quarters. You and Max could stay there while we work on his training. And, he added, his eyes twinkling, I could use an assistant trainer. Someone who really understands dogs like Max. The offer hung in the air, its implications slowly sinking in. Zoe's mind raced. A safe place to stay, a chance to be with Max, to learn and do something meaningful. It seemed too good to be true, but the street-hardened part of her whispered caution. What's the catch? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake's expression turned serious. The catch is that it won't be easy. Training takes hard work and dedication. And he hesitated, choosing his words carefully. We'd need to sort out your legal situation. I can't just take in a minor without going through proper channels. But, he quickly added, seeing the fear flash in Zoe's eyes, I promise you this. Whatever happens, you and Max will stay together. That's non-negotiable. Zoe felt overwhelmed. The possibility of a new life, so close she could almost touch it, warred with her ingrained distrust of the system that had failed her before. She looked at Max, who gazed back at her with complete trust, then at Dr. Chen, whose kind eyes held a glimmer of hope, and finally at Jake, whose open expression invited her to take a chance. In that moment, surrounded by more kindness than she had known in years, Zoe made a decision that would alter the course of her life. Okay, she said, her voice small but firm. We'll do it. The relief and joy that spread across Jake and Dr. Chun's faces were palpable. But before they could respond, Zoe added, but if anything goes wrong, if anyone tries to separate us, Max and I are out of it. Deal? Jake nodded solemnly. Deal, he said, extending his hand to shake on it. As Zoe's small hand met his larger one, she felt a spark of hope ignite in her chest. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Dr. Chun made calls to her contacts in social services, leveraging her reputation to expedite the process of making Jake a temporary guardian. Jake left to prepare the living quarters at his training facility, promising to return before nightfall. As the adults bustled around her, Zoe sat quietly with Max, her mind trying to process the rapid changes in her life. Just yesterday, she had been alone on the streets, focused solely on survival. Now, she was on the cusp of a new beginning, one filled with possibility and purpose. What do you think, Max? She whispered to the dog, who looked up at her with his warm brown eyes. Are we doing the right thing? Max's response was to nuzzle her hand, his tail wagging gently. Zoe smiled, taking comfort in the unconditional love and trust of her canine companion. As the afternoon wore on, Dr. Chun sat down with Zoe, explaining the process that lay ahead. There would be meetings with social workers, paperwork to fill out, and likely some difficult conversations about her past. But through it all, Dr. Chun assured her, she would have support. You're not alone anymore, Zoe, the veterinarian said softly. I know it's scary to trust again, but Jake, myself, and even Max here, we're all on your side. Zoe nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. The kindness of these virtual strangers, their willingness to go out of their way to help her and Max, was almost overwhelming. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, things could get better. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the clinic windows, the door chimed once more. Jake had returned, his truck loaded with supplies for Max and a small suitcase of clothes for Zoe. Donations from a local charity he worked with. Ready to go home? He asked, his voice gentle and free of pressure. Zoe took a deep breath, looking around at the clinic that had become a sanctuary, at Dr. Chun, who had shown her such kindness, and finally at Max, who stood eagerly at her side. Yeah, she said, surprised to find she meant it. We're ready. As they walked out of the clinic, Zoe carrying Max's new leash and Jake hefting their meager belongings, Dr. Chun called out, remember, you two are welcome here anytime. This is always a safe place for you. Zoe turned back, a small smile tugging at her lips. Thank you, she said, the words carrying the weight of all she couldn't express. For everything, as Jake's truck pulled away from the curb, Zoe watched the city streets roll by, streets that just days ago had been her whole world. Now, They were simply the backdrop to a journey into the unknown. Max sat beside her, his head resting on her lap, a constant reminder that whatever lay ahead, she wasn't facing it alone. The city gave way to suburbs, and finally to a more rural landscape. As they turned onto a tree-lined drive, Jake announced, "Here we are. Home sweet home." Zoe peered out the window, taking in the sight of a large, farmhouse-style building surrounded by fenced fields. In the fading light, she could make out the shapes of several dogs playing in one of the enclosures. As the truck came to a stop, Zoe felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension. This was it, the beginning of her new life. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she was ready to face them, with Max by her side and the support of people who, against all odds, had chosen to believe in her. Taking a deep breath, Zoe opened the truck door, stepping out into the cool evening air. As her feet touched the ground of what would become her new home, she felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time: hope. The journey ahead would be filled with ups and downs, challenges and triumphs. But for the first time in years, Zoe wasn't just surviving. She was on the cusp of truly living. And as Max bounded out of the truck, tail wagging with excitement at the new scents and sounds around them, Zoe knew that together they could face anything. As Jake led Zoe and Max towards the farmhouse, the sound of barking filled the air. Zoe instinctively tensed, her hand tightening on Max's leash. Sensing her unease, Jake paused, turning to face her with a reassuring smile. "Don't worry," he said gently. "The dogs are all in their enclosures. They're just excited to meet new friends." He gestured towards a large barn-like structure off to the side. "That's where we do most of our training. The house is our quiet zone. No dogs allowed inside except for special circumstances." Zoe nodded, relaxing slightly. As they approached the house, she took in the details. The wraparound porch with its comfortable-looking rocking chairs, the warm yellow light spilling from the windows, the neatly tended flower beds. It looked like something out of a storybook, a far cry from the cold, impersonal foster home she'd known or the harsh reality of the streets. Jake opened the front door, ushering them into a cozy entryway. The interior was warm and inviting, with wooden floors and walls adorned with photos of dogs and people. The smell of something delicious wafted from what Zoe assumed was the kitchen. "Sarah," Jake called out, "we're home." A woman's voice responded from deeper in the house, in the kitchen. "Dinner's almost ready." Jake turned to Zoe with a grin. "That's my wife, Sarah. She's been excited to meet you." He must have noticed the flicker of anxiety that crossed Zoe's face because he quickly added, "Don't worry. Sarah's great with kids and dogs alike. She helps out with the training program too." As they made their way towards the kitchen, Zoe's nose was assaulted by the mouth-watering aroma of home-cooked food. It had been so long since she'd had a proper meal that her stomach growled audibly, causing her cheeks to flush with embarrassment. Jake pretended not to notice, instead focusing on helping Max navigate the new environment. The dog seemed fascinated by the new smells, his tail wagging tentatively as he explored. They entered the kitchen to find a woman with kind eyes and a warm smile stirring something on the stove. Sarah turned to greet them, her face lighting up at the sight of Zoe and Max. "Welcome home," she said, her voice filled with genuine warmth. "You must be Zoe, and this handsome fellow must be Max." She approached slowly, giving Zoe time to adjust to her presence. "I'm so glad you're here." Zoe mumbled a quiet thanks, overwhelmed by the welcoming atmosphere and the delicious smell of food. Sarah seemed to understand, not pushing for more conversation. "Why don't you two get settled in?" she suggested. "Jake can show you to your room, and dinner will be ready in about 15 minutes. I made lasagna. I hope that's okay?" Zoe nodded, unable to remember the last time she'd had lasagna. As Jake led her upstairs, Max trotting alongside them, Zoe felt a strange mix of emotions. Part of her was excited about this new beginning, while another part remained wary, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Jake opened a door, revealing a cozy bedroom with a single bed, a desk, and a small dresser. A plush dog bed sat in the corner. "This is your space," Jake said. "Feel free to make it your own. The bathroom is right across the hall, and Sarah and I are just down at the end if you need anything." Zoe stepped into the room, taking in the soft blue walls and the fluffy comforter on the bed. It was more space than she'd had to herself in years. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. Jake nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Take your time. Come down when you're ready." With that, he left, closing the door gently behind him. Alone in the room with Max, Zoe sat on the edge of the bed, running her hand over the smooth comforter. Max placed his head on her knee, looking up at her with those soulful eyes. "What do you think, boy?" she whispered. "Is this for real?" Max's tail thumped against the floor, his whole body wiggling with what could only be described as happiness. Despite her lingering doubts, Zoe couldn't help but smile. If Max felt safe here, maybe she could too. After taking a few minutes to freshen up in the bathroom, marveling at the clean towels and the array of toiletries laid out for her use, Zoe made her way back downstairs, Max at her heels. The kitchen table was set for 3, the lasagna steaming in the center alongside a fresh salad and what looked like homemade garlic bread. The sight and smell made Zoe's mouth water. "Perfect timing," Sarah said warmly as Zoe entered. "Have a seat. Would you like some water or milk with your dinner?" "Water, please," Zoe replied, sliding into a chair. Max settled at her feet, clearly understanding that this was not his mealtime. As they began to eat, Jake and Sarah kept the conversation light, not pressing Zoe for details about her past or bombarding her with questions about the future. Instead, they told her about the training facility, sharing funny stories about some of the dogs they'd worked with. Zoe found herself relaxing as the meal progressed, even managing a small laugh at Jake's tale of a particularly mischievous poodle who had outsmarted all of their usual training techniques. As they finished eating, Sarah turned to Zoe with a gentle smile. "I know this is all very new and probably a bit overwhelming," she said. "We want you to know that there's no pressure here. You and Max are safe, and we'll take things one day at a time, okay?" Zoe nodded, grateful for the understanding. What happens now?" she asked hesitantly. Jake leaned forward, his expression serious but kind. "Well, tomorrow we'll need to meet with a social worker. They'll want to talk to you about your situation and make sure you're safe and comfortable here. After that, we'll start working on getting you enrolled in school. The word sent a jolt of anxiety through Zoe. She hadn't been in a classroom in over 2 years. I don't know if I can," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's okay to be nervous," Sarah reassured her. "We'll take it slow. There's a great alternative program at the local school for kids who've been out of the system for a while. They'll help you catch up at your own pace." Jake nodded in agreement. "And in the meantime, you'll be helping me with Max's training. We'll start tomorrow afternoon, after the meeting with the social worker. How does that sound?" The thought of working with Max, of having a purpose, eased some of Zoe's anxiety. "That sounds good," she said, managing a small smile. As they cleared the table, Zoe insisted on helping with the dishes, falling into an easy rhythm with Sarah. The simple domesticity of the task was soothing, reminding her of evenings spent in the kitchen with her mother, back when her world made sense. Later, as Zoe prepared for bed, she found herself standing at the window of her new room, looking out at the starry sky. Max lay on his new bed, already half asleep. The events of the past few days felt surreal, like a dream she might wake up from at any moment. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Come in," she called quietly. Jake poked his head in, smiling when he saw her at the window. "Just wanted to say goodnight," he said, "and to give you this." He held out a small device. "It's a nightlight that projects stars onto the ceiling. Sarah thought you might like it." Zoe took the nightlight, touched by the thoughtful gesture. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Jake nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Sleep well, Zoe. Remember, we're just down the hall if you need anything. Good night." As the door closed behind him, Zoe plugged in the nightlight, watching in wonder as a galaxy of stars spread across her ceiling. She crawled into bed, the soft sheets a luxury she had almost forgotten. Max, sensing her need for comfort, hopped up onto the bed, curling up at her feet. In the soft glow of the projected stars, with the warm weight of Max against her legs, Zoe felt a peace she hadn't known in years. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, meetings with social workers, the daunting prospect of returning to school, the unknown territory of dog training. But for now, in this moment, Zoe allowed herself to hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, she and Max had found a place where they could heal, grow, and build a new life together. As sleep began to claim her, Zoe's last conscious thought was of gratitude for Max, for the kindness of strangers who were quickly becoming friends, and for the chance to start anew. Whatever the future held, she knew she wouldn't face it alone. The next morning, Zoe woke to the unfamiliar sensation of sunlight streaming through curtains and the soft snoring of Max at her feet. For a moment, disorientation gripped her as she took in the cozy bedroom, so different from the harsh realities of the streets she had grown accustomed to. Then, as memories of the previous day flooded back, a mix of emotions washed over her: hope, anxiety, and a cautious excitement for what lay ahead. As she sat up, stretching muscles that felt more relaxed than they had in years, a gentle knock sounded at the door. "Zoe?" Sarah's voice called softly. "Are you awake? Breakfast will be ready in about 20 minutes if you'd like to join us." "Okay, thank you," Zoe replied, her voice still thick with sleep. "I'll be down soon." The prospect of a proper breakfast was enticing, but as Zoe went through her morning routine, marveling at the luxury of a hot shower and clean clothes, anxiety began to gnaw at her. Today was the day she would meet with the social worker. Despite Jake and Sarah's reassurances, years of disappointment and broken promises made it hard for Zoe to believe that things could really work out. Max, sensing her unease, pressed close to her side as they made their way downstairs. The smell of bacon and coffee filled the air, and Zoe's stomach growled in anticipation. In the kitchen, Jake and Sarah moved around each other with the easy familiarity of a long-married couple, setting out plates and pouring juice. They greeted Zoe with warm smiles, not commenting on the dark circles under her eyes that betrayed a restless night. "Good morning, Zoe," Jake said cheerfully. "How do you like your eggs?" The simple question, so normal, so domestic, almost brought tears to Zoe's eyes. How long had it been since someone had cared about such a small detail of her life? "Scrambled, please," she managed to reply, her voice barely above a whisper. As they sat down to eat, Sarah gently broached the subject of the day ahead. "The social worker, Miss Martinez, will be here at 10. She's very nice, Zoe. Her job is to make sure you're safe and well cared for. That's all." Zoe nodded, pushing her eggs around her plate. What if she wants to take me away? The fear that had been building since the previous night finally found voice. Jake reached across the table, his hand stopping just short of Zoe's, close enough to offer comfort, but not intruding on her personal space. "Zoe, look at me," he said gently. When she met his gaze, he continued, "We promised you that you and Max would stay together, remember? Sarah and I meant that. We're on your side. We'll do everything in our power to make sure you stay here, if that's what you want." The sincerity in his voice was almost overwhelming. Zoe nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. The rest of breakfast passed in a blur of nervous anticipation. Before Zoe knew it, the doorbell was ringing, announcing Miss Martinez's arrival. The social worker was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She greeted Zoe warmly, then asked to speak with her privately. Jake and Sarah exchanged a glance before Jake suggested, "Why don't you use my office? It's just down the hall." As Zoe followed Miss Martinez, she felt Max press against her leg. The social worker noticed and smiled. "Is it okay if Max comes with us? He seems to be a great source of comfort for you." Zoe nodded gratefully, relief washing over her. Already, this was going better than she had dared to hope. In Jake's office, Miss Martinez got straight to the point. "Zoe, I know you've been through a lot. My job is to make sure you're in a safe, stable environment where you can thrive. Can you tell me how you're feeling about staying here with Jake and Sarah?" For a moment, Zoe was silent, her hand absently stroking Max's fur as she gathered her thoughts. Then, haltingly at first but with growing confidence, she began to speak. She told Miss Martinez about her life on the streets, about finding Max, and about the kindness Jake and Sarah had shown her. "I know it's only been a day," Zoe concluded, "but I feel safe here. For the first time in a long time, I feel like maybe things could get better." Miss Martinez listened attentively, asking clarifying questions but never pushing too hard. When Zoe finished, the social worker smiled warmly. "Thank you for sharing that with me, Zoe. I can see that you and Max have a very special bond. And it's clear that Jake and Sarah want to support both of you." She paused, her expression becoming more serious. "There will be challenges ahead. We'll need to work on getting you back into school, and there will be regular check-ins to make sure everything is going well. But from what I've seen and heard, I believe this could be a very positive placement for you." The knot of anxiety in Zoe's chest began to loosen. "So, I can stay?" Miss Martinez nodded. "As long as you want to, and as long as everything continues to go well, yes. We'll set up a formal fostering arrangement with Jake and Sarah." The relief that flooded through Zoe was almost dizzying. Max, picking up on her change in mood, wagged his tail enthusiastically, earning a chuckle from Ms. Martinez. After a few more questions and explanations about the process moving forward, Ms. Martinez concluded the interview. As they walked back to the living room, where Jake and Sarah waited anxiously, the social worker placed a gentle hand on Zoe's shoulder. "You're a very brave young woman, Zoe," she said softly. "I know trusting people isn't easy for you, but I want you to know that you have a whole team of people rooting for you now, including me." Zoe nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. As they entered the living room, Jake and Sarah stood, their faces a mix of hope and apprehension. Miss Martinez smiled at them. "Well, if everyone's in agreement, I think we've found a wonderful foster placement for Zoe and Max." The joy and relief that spread across Jake and Sarah's faces were palpable. Sarah moved as if to hug Zoe, then caught herself, respecting the girl's boundaries. Instead, she clasped her hands together, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "We're so glad," she said simply. As Ms. Martinez went over the details with Jake and Sarah, Zoe found herself sinking onto the couch, suddenly overwhelmed by the enormity of what was happening. Max immediately hopped up next to her, resting his head on her lap. The familiar weight was grounding, reminding her that through all the changes, this connection remained constant. After Miss Martinez left, promising to be in touch soon with more details about school enrollment and future check-ins, a moment of silence fell over the room. It was Jake who finally broke it, his voice gentle but excited. "Well, Zoe, how about we celebrate by starting Max's training? I thought we could begin with some basic obedience work in the yard. What do you think?" The prospect of doing something practical, of focusing on Max and learning a new skill, was exactly what Zoe needed. She nodded, managing a small smile. "That sounds great." As they headed outside, the warm sun on her face and Max trotting happily beside her, Zoe felt a glimmer of something she had almost forgotten: hope for the future. The road ahead would undoubtedly have its challenges, but for the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was facing them alone. With each step towards the training area, Zoe felt as though she was walking not just into a new chapter of her life, but into a whole new story, one where she and Max could heal, grow, and perhaps even thrive. The journey was just beginning, but already, Zoe could sense that rescuing Max had set in motion a chain of events that would change both their lives in ways she could never have imagined. As Jake led Zoe and Max to the training area, a fenced enclosure with various obstacles and equipment, Zoe felt a mixture of excitement and nervousness. This was all so new, yet somehow it felt right. "All right," Jake said, clapping his hands together. "Let's start with the basics. The foundation of all good training is a strong bond between human and dog. Luckily, you two already have that in spades." Zoe couldn't help but smile at that. It was true. In the short time they'd been together, she and Max had formed an unbreakable connection. Jake continued, "We'll begin with some simple commands. Sit, stay, come. The key is consistency and positive reinforcement. Always reward good behavior with treats, praise, or both." For the next hour, Jake guided Zoe through the basics of dog training. To her surprise, Zoe found herself thoroughly enjoying the process. There was something deeply satisfying about communicating with Max, watching his eager attempts to understand and obey her commands. Max, for his part, proved to be a quick learner, His intelligence and eagerness to please shone through, and more than once, Jake remarked on his potential. "He's a natural," Jake said, watching as Max perfectly executed a stay command, despite the temptation of a treat just out of reach. "And you, Zoe, you have a real gift for this." Zoe felt a warmth spread through her chest at the praise. It had been so long since she'd felt good at anything, since she'd had an adult look at her with pride rather than pity or indifference. As they wrapped up the training session, Jake turned to Zoe with a serious expression. "Zoe, I want to run something by you. As I mentioned before, we train therapy dogs here. Dogs that can provide comfort and support to people in hospitals, nursing homes, schools, anywhere people might need a furry friend to brighten their day." Zoe nodded, remembering their earlier conversation. "Well," Jake continued, "I think Max has the potential to be an exceptional therapy dog. He's smart, gentle, and he clearly has a strong bond with you. What would you think about training him for that purpose?" Zoe's eyes widened. The idea of Max being able to help others, to bring joy and comfort to people in need, filled her with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. I think that would be amazing," she said softly. Jake smiled broadly. "I'm glad you feel that way, because I have another proposition for you. How would you like to be my assistant trainer? You'd work with Max, of course, but also help with some of our other dogs in training. It would be a job, a paying job, single quotes." For a moment, Zoe was speechless. A job, a chance to learn, to contribute, to earn her own money? It seemed almost too good to be true. "Really?" she managed to ask. "You trust me with that?" Jake's expression softened. "Zoe, in just one session, you've shown a natural talent for this work. Your instincts are good, and your bond with Max is exceptional. Yes, I trust you. So, what do you say?" Zoe looked down at Max, who gazed up at her with those soulful eyes, tail wagging gently. Then she looked back at Jake, seeing the sincerity in his face. "Yes," she said, her voice stronger than she expected. "Yes, I'd like that very much." The rest of the day passed in a whirlwind of activity. Sarah took Zoe shopping for some new clothes and school supplies, an experience that was both exciting and overwhelming for the girl who had owned nothing but the clothes on her back for so long. As they browsed the aisles of a department store, Sarah gently broached the subject of school. The social worker mentioned an alternative program at the local high school, she said. "It's designed for students who've been out of traditional schooling for a while. They'll assess where you are academically and create a personalized plan to help you catch up." How does that sound? Zoe chewed her lip nervously. The thought of returning to school was daunting, to say the least. I don't know if I can," she admitted softly. "It's been so long. I'm probably way behind." Sarah placed a gentle hand on Zoe's shoulder. "It's okay to be nervous," she said. "But remember, you're not alone in this. Jake and I will support you every step of the way. And think about it this way. You're already proving how quickly you can learn with Max's training. School will just be another kind of training, right?" But that way, the prospect seemed a little less terrifying. Zoe managed a small nod. "I'll try," she said. Sarah beamed at her. "That's all anyone can ask. Now, how about we pick out some cool notebooks for your classes?" By the time they returned home, laden with bags of new clothes and school supplies, Zoe was exhausted but filled with a sense of anticipation she hadn't felt in years. The future, which had always seemed like a dark, uncertain thing, was suddenly full of possibilities. That evening, as they sat down to dinner, Jake raised his glass of water in a toast. "To new beginnings," he said, smiling at Zoe, "and to the newest member of our training team." As Zoe clinked her glass with Jake and Sarah's, she felt a lump form in her throat. These people, who were virtual strangers just days ago, had opened their home and their hearts to her. They were offering her not just a place to stay, but a chance at a real future. Later that night, as Zoe lay in bed with Max curled up at her feet, she reflected on the whirlwind her life had become. In just a few short days, she had gone from a homeless orphan to, what? A foster child. Yes, but also a dog trainer in training, a soon-to-be student, a girl with a purpose. The changes were overwhelming, and a part of her still waited for the other shoe to drop. for this all to be revealed as some elaborate dream. But as she reached down to stroke Max's soft fur, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this was real. She thought about the day ahead, more training with Max, preparation for starting school, learning the ropes of her new job at the training facility. It was daunting, but for the first time in years, Zoe felt ready to face the challenges head-on. As she drifted off to sleep, the star projector casting a gentle glow across the ceiling, Zoe's last conscious thought was one of gratitude. Gratitude for Max, for the twist of fate that had brought them together. Gratitude for Jake and Sarah, for their kindness and belief in her. And gratitude for the chance to start anew, to build a life she never thought possible. The journey ahead would not be easy. There would be setbacks and struggles, moments of doubt and fear. But as Zoe slipped into dreams filled with wagging tails and open horizons, she knew that whatever came, she wouldn't face it alone. She had Max, she had Jake and Sarah, and most importantly, she had hope, a powerful force that once ignited could light the way through even the darkest of times. The story of Zoe and Max was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. And as the stars twinkled on her ceiling and the night wrapped around them like a protective blanket, the future stretched out before them, full of promise and possibility. As the weeks passed, Zoe settled into a routine that felt both foreign and comforting. Each morning, she woke early to help Jake with the morning feeding and exercise routines for the dogs at the training facility. The work was physical and demanding, but Zoe found herself enjoying the structure and purpose it brought to her days. Max's training progressed rapidly. His intelligence and eagerness to please made him an ideal candidate for therapy work. Zoe threw herself into the training sessions with a dedication that surprised even Jake. She absorbed every technique, every nuance of communication between handler and dog, with an intensity born of finally finding something she was truly good at. One crisp autumn morning, as Zoe led Max through a particularly complex series of commands, Jake watched with undisguised pride. "You know," he said as Zoe finished the routine, "I think you two are ready for your first off-site training session." Zoe's eyes widened. "Really? You mean like going to an actual place where therapy dogs work?" Jake nodded, smiling. "Exactly. I was thinking we could start with the children's ward at the local hospital. It's a controlled environment, and the kids there could really use some canine comfort. What do you think?" The idea both excited and terrified Zoe. On one hand, the thought of Max bringing joy to sick children filled her with a sense of purpose. On the other, the prospect of interacting with strangers in a new environment was daunting. Sensing her hesitation, Jake added gently, "You don't have to decide right now. Think about it. Talk it over with Sarah. This is a big step, and it's okay if you're not ready." Zoe appreciated his understanding, but something inside her had already made the decision. "No, I want to do it," she said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "Max is ready, and I think I am too." The pride in Jake's eyes was unmistakable. "That's my girl," he said softly, then quickly added, "That's great. Zoe, we'll set it up for next week." The slip didn't go unnoticed by Zoe. A warm feeling spread through her chest at Jake's words. In the weeks she'd been living with them, Jake and Sarah had become more than just foster parents or employers. They had become family in a way Zoe had thought she'd never have again. The day of their first hospital visit arrived all too quickly. Zoe stood in front of the mirror, adjusting the volunteer badge clipped to her shirt. The girl staring back at her was almost unrecognizable from the street kid she'd been just months ago. Clean, well-fed, with a spark of purpose in her eyes, Zoe looked normal. The thought was both comforting and strange. "You ready, kiddo?" Sarah's voice called from downstairs. "Coming," Zoe replied, giving herself one last look in the mirror before heading down, Max trotting loyally at her heels. The drive to the hospital was quiet. Zoe lost in thought as she absently stroked Max's fur. Jake, sensing her nervousness, kept the conversation light, sharing funny stories about his early days as a dog trainer. As they pulled into the hospital parking lot, Jake turned to Zoe with a serious expression. "Remember, he said gently. You're not just Max's Hamilton. You're a beacon of hope for these kids. Your story, your resilience, that's as therapeutic as any dog could be. Zoe nodded, touched by his words and the faith he had in her. As they walked into the hospital, Max's therapy dog was drawing curious and appreciative glances. Zoe felt a mix of anxiety and excitement bubbling in her chest. The children's ward was a riot of color, with cheerful murals adorning the walls in an attempt to brighten the otherwise clinical environment. As they approached the nurse's station, Zoe could feel the eyes of patients and staff alike on them. A kind-faced nurse greeted them warmly. You must be the therapy dog team we've been expecting, she said, smiling down at Max. The kids have been so excited since we told them you were coming. Jake handled the introductions and paperwork, allowing Zoe a moment to acclimate to the new environment. As they were led down the hallway, the nurse explained the various patients they'd be visiting, their conditions, and any special considerations. Their first stop was a room shared by two young patients, a girl about Zoe's age named Emily, who was recovering from a car accident, and a younger boy named Tyler, undergoing treatment for leukemia. As they entered the room, Zoe felt a momentary panic. What should she say? How could she possibly bring comfort to these kids who had been through so much? But then she felt Max press against her leg, a steady, reassuring presence, and she took a deep breath. Hi, she said, her voice stronger than she expected. I'm Zoe, and this is Max. We heard you guys might like some company. The transformation on the children's faces was immediate and profound. Emily's eyes lit up, a smile breaking through the pain evident on her face. Tyler, pale and thin from his treatments, sat up straighter in his bed, his gaze fixed on Max. Can I pet him? Tyler asked hesitantly. Of course, Zoe replied, guiding Max to the side of Tyler's bed. He loves to be petted. Don't you, Max? As if on cue, Max gently placed his head on Tyler's lap, looking up at the boy with those soulful eyes that had first captured Zoe's heart. Tyler's small hand reached out, tentatively at first, then with more confidence as he stroked Max's soft fur. He's so soft, Tyler marveled, a genuine smile spreading across his face. For the next hour, Zoe and Max moved from room to room, bringing moments of joy and distraction to children battling illnesses and injuries far beyond their years. Zoe found herself sharing stories of Max's training, demonstrating tricks, and even opening up about her own journey from the streets to becoming a dog trainer. In one room, they met a young girl named Sophie who had been in the hospital for months due to a rare genetic disorder. As Max settled his head gently on Sophie's bed, the girl looked up at Zoe with curious eyes. Were you really homeless? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Zoe hesitated for a moment, then nodded. Yes, I was. For a while. And now you're not? Sophie pressed. No, not anymore. I found Max, or maybe he found me, and, well, things got better. Sophie was quiet for a moment, her hand absently stroking Max's fur. Then, in a voice filled with a wisdom beyond her years, she said, I'm glad you found each other. Everyone needs someone to love them, especially when things are hard. Zoe felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. You're right, she said softly. Everyone does. As they left Sophie's room, Zoe caught Jake's eye. The pride and emotion she saw there made her heart swell. She was doing this. She was making a difference. By the time they finished their rounds, Zoe was emotionally and physically drained, but filled with a sense of accomplishment unlike anything she'd ever experienced. As they walked back to the car, Jake placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. You did amazing in there, Zoe, he said. Those kids, you gave them hope. You showed them that no matter how tough things get, there's always a chance for things to get better. Zoe nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. As they drove home, Max's head resting contentedly in her lap, Zoe reflected on the day's events. She had gone into the hospital thinking she and Max were there to help others. But in reality, the experience had helped her just as much. For the first time, Zoe truly understood the impact she and Max could have. They weren't just a girl and her dog. They were a symbol of resilience, of the healing power of love and companionship. As the familiar streets of their neighborhood came into view, Zoe made a silent promise to herself and to Max. they would continue this work, touching lives and bringing hope to those who needed it most. The journey that had begun on a cold street corner with a wounded dog had led her here, to a place of purpose, of belonging, of making a real difference in the world. And as they pulled into the driveway of the place Zoe now called home, she knew that this was just the beginning of their story. As the weeks turned into months, Zoe and Max's visits to the hospital became a regular part of their routine. Each visit brought new challenges and rewards, deepening their bond and honing their skills as a therapy team. Zoe found herself growing more confident with each interaction, her natural empathy blossoming as she connected with patients of all ages. Meanwhile, Zoe's journey back into education was proving to be a challenging but rewarding experience. The alternative program at the local high school had been a godsend, allowing her to work at her own pace to catch up on the years of schooling she had missed. There were frustrating days when the work seemed overwhelming, but Zoe approached her studies with the same determination she brought to Max's training. Sarah had become a constant source of support, spending evenings at the kitchen table helping Zoe with her homework. Jake, too, found ways to incorporate Zoe's schoolwork into their training sessions, using math to calculate feeding portions or biology lessons to explain canine behavior. One crisp autumn afternoon, as Zoe sat on the porch steps working through a particularly challenging math problem, she felt a presence beside her. Looking up, she saw Jake lowering himself to sit next to her, two steaming mugs in his hands. "Thought you could use a study break," he said, offering her one of the mugs. The rich aroma of hot chocolate filled the air. "Thanks," Zoe said gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warm mug. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching Max chase leaves across the yard. "You know," Jake began, his tone casual, but with an undercurrent of seriousness, "Sarah and I have been talking." Zoe felt a flutter of anxiety in her chest. In her experience, adults talking usually led to upheaval in her life. She braced herself for bad news. Jake must have sensed her tension because he quickly continued, "It's nothing bad, I promise. Actually, we were hoping to discuss something with you that could be really good for all of us." Zoe relaxed slightly, curiosity overtaking her anxiety. "Okay," she said cautiously. Jake took a deep breath. "Zoe, you've been with us for almost 6 months now. In that time, you've become more than just a foster child or an employee. Your family, Sarah and I, well, we've been thinking about making that official. We'd like to adopt you, if that's something you'd want." The world seemed to stop for a moment. Zoe stared at Jake, sure she must have misheard. "Adopt? Me?" she whispered. Jake nodded, his eyes full of warmth and hope. "Yes, we love you, Zoe. You and Max both. We want to make this your forever home, legally and in every other way. But only if it's what you want too." A tidal wave of emotion crashed over Zoe. Joy, fear, hope, disbelief. They all swirled together, leaving her speechless. She had dreamed of this moment for so long, but had eventually convinced herself it would never happen. And now here it was, being offered so openly, so lovingly. "I don't know what to say," Zoe managed, her voice choked with emotion. Jake placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You don't have to say anything right now. This is a big decision. Take some time to think about it. Talk it over with Max," he added with a wink, lightening the mood. "We just want you to know that the option is there and that we're committed to you, no matter what you decide." Zoe nodded, grateful for the space to process this monumental offer. As Jake stood to go back inside, giving her shoulder a gentle squeeze, Zoe called out, "Jake?" He turned, an expectant look on his face. "Thank you," Zoe said softly. For everything. Single quotes. Jake's smile was warm and genuine. "No, Zoe, thank you. You and Max, you've brought so much joy into our lives. We're the lucky ones." As Jake disappeared into the house, Zoe sat on the steps, her mind reeling. She watched Max, who had abandoned his leaf chasing, to come sit at her feet, his brown eyes looking up at her with unconditional love. "What do you think, boy?" she whispered, scratching behind his ears. "Should we make this our forever home?" Max's tail thumped against the porch in what Zoe chose to interpret as enthusiastic agreement. The next few days passed in a blur of emotion for Zoe. She found herself hyper-aware of every interaction with Jake and Sarah, seeing their casual affection and support in a new light. Had it always been there, this love she'd been too scared to recognize. During their hospital visits, Zoe found herself sharing her news with some of the long-term patients they had grown close to. Sophie, the wise beyond her years girl they had met on their first visit, listened intently as Zoe poured out her conflicting emotions. "You're scared," Sophie said. Not a question, but a statement of fact. Zoe nodded. "Is that crazy? To be scared of something I've wanted for so long?" Sophie shook her head, her hand absently stroking Max's fur. "It's not crazy. It's brave." "Brave?" Zoe echoed, confused. "Yeah," Sophie said. "It's brave to let yourself hope again, to let people love you when you've been hurt before. That's the bravest thing there is." Zoe felt tears prick at her eyes, touched by the young girl's insight. "When did you get so smart?" she asked, managing a watery smile. Sophie grinned. "Must be all these hospital drugs," she joked, lightening the mood. As they left Sophie's room that day, Zoe felt a sense of clarity beginning to form. The fear was still there, but it was being steadily overshadowed by something stronger: hope and the realization that she had already begun to think of Jake and Sarah as family. That evening, after dinner, Zoe asked Jake and Sarah if they could talk. The three of them, with Max curled up at Zoe's feet, gathered in the living room. Zoe took a deep breath, steeling herself for what she was about to say. "I've been thinking a lot about your offer," she began, her voice shaky but determined. "About adoption. And I want to say yes. If you're sure, if you really want me." The joy that spread across Jake and Sarah's faces was answer enough. But Sarah spoke, her voice thick with emotion. "Oh, Zoe, we've never been more sure of anything in our lives." What followed was a group hug that included Max, who seemed to sense the importance of the moment and insisted on being part of it. There were tears, happy ones, and laughter, and promises of a future together. The next few months were a whirlwind of activity. There were meetings with social workers, paperwork to file, and court dates to attend. Through it all, Zoe marveled at Jake and Sarah's unwavering commitment. Every step of the way, they made sure she felt included and heard in the process. Finally, on a bright spring morning, Zoe stood before a judge, flanked by Jake and Sarah, with Max sitting obediently at her side. As the judge declared them legally a family, Zoe felt a profound shift within herself. The last vestiges of the scared, lonely girl from the streets fell away, replaced by a young woman with a family, a purpose, and a future full of promise. As they left the courthouse, now officially the Thompson family, Zoe knelt down to Max's level. "We did it, boy," she whispered, wrapping her arms around his neck. "We found our forever home." Max's tail wagged furiously, his whole body wiggling with joy, as if he understood the significance of the moment. Jake placed a hand on Zoe's shoulder. "Ready to go home, kiddo?" Zoe stood, a bright smile on her face. "Yeah, Dad," she said, testing out the word. It felt right. "Let's go home." As they drove away from the courthouse, Zoe reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From a scared, lonely girl on the streets to a beloved daughter, a promising student, and half of a renowned therapy dog team. It was a transformation she could scarcely have imagined. Yet here she was, living proof that sometimes the simple act of showing kindness to a stray dog, to a lost child, could set in motion a chain of events that could change lives in the most profound ways. As the car turned onto the familiar street leading to their home, her home, Zoe felt a sense of peace settle over her. The road ahead would undoubtedly have its challenges, but she was no longer facing them alone. She had Max, her loyal companion. She had Jake and Sarah, her parents in every way that mattered. And she had a purpose: to spread the love and hope she had been given to others who needed it most. The story of Mina Herfana, who saved the dog, had come full circle. In saving Max, Zoe had saved herself, and in the process, discovered the true meaning of family, love, and belonging. As spring blossomed into summer, Zoe found herself facing a new set of challenges and opportunities. With her adoption finalized, and her place in the Thompson family secure, she began to look towards the future with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. One warm evening, as the family sat on the porch enjoying the lingering twilight, Jake broached a subject that had been on his mind for some time. "Zoe," he began, his tone casual but with an undercurrent of seriousness. "Sarah and I have been thinking. You've come so far with Max's training and your work at the hospital. We think it might be time to take things to the next level." Zoe looked up from where she was absently stroking Max's fur. Curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" Sarah leaned forward, her eyes bright with excitement. "We've been approached by a national organization that certifies therapy dog teams. They're interested in featuring you and Max in a promotional campaign." Zoe's eyes widened. "Us? Really?" Jake nodded, a proud smile on his face. "Really? They've heard about the work you've been doing at the hospital, especially your connection with the long-term pediatric patients. They think your story can inspire others to get involved in therapy dog work." The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. Zoe had grown more confident in her interactions at the hospital, but the thought of being in the public eye on a national level was daunting. I don't know," she said hesitant. "What would we have to do?" "Well," Sarah explained, "it would involve some interviews, photo shoots, maybe even a short documentary about your journey together. They're particularly interested in how your relationship with Max has helped in your own healing process." Zoe fell silent, her mind racing. The idea of sharing her story, of being vulnerable in front of strangers, was scary. But then she thought of Sophie and the other children at the hospital, of how her experiences had given them hope. Could sharing her story on a larger scale have an even bigger impact? "You don't have to decide right away," Jake assured her, sensing her inner conflict. "Take some time to think about it. Talk it over with Max," he added with a wink, eliciting a small smile from Zoe. That night, as Zoe lay in bed with Max curled up at her feet, she mulled over the proposition. She thought back to the scared, lonely girl she had been on the streets and how far she had come. Would that girl have believed this future was possible? As if sensing her tumultuous thoughts, Max lifted his head, his soulful brown eyes meeting hers. Zoe smiled, reaching out to scratch behind his ears. "What do you think, boy?" she whispered. "Should we share our story?" Max's tail thumped against the bed in what Zoe chose to interpret as encouragement. She chuckled softly, feeling some of her anxiety ease. "Yeah, I think so too." The next morning, Zoe announced her decision to Jake and Sarah over breakfast. Their proud smiles and words of encouragement bolstered her confidence. This was a big step, but she wouldn't be facing it alone. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Zoe met with representatives from the therapy dog organization, sharing her story and discussing ideas for the campaign. To her surprise, she found herself growing more comfortable with each retelling of her journey. The photo shoot was held at the hospital, capturing Zoe and Max in action with some of the patients they had grown close to. Sophie, now in remission and preparing to go home, was front and center, her beaming smile a testament to the impact Zoe and Max had made. As the photographer snapped pictures of Zoe and Max with a group of children, she overheard one of the organization representatives talking to Jake. "You must be so proud," the woman said. "Zoe is truly remarkable." Jake's response made Zoe's heart swell. "We are," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But the remarkable thing is how she's made us better. Zoe and Max, they've taught us more about love, resilience, and the power of second chances than we could ever have imagined." The documentary filming was more challenging. Zoe found herself revisiting places from her past. The park where she had first found Max, the streets she had once called home. It was emotional, at times overwhelming, but Zoe pushed through, Max a constant, comforting presence at her side. One particularly difficult day involved an interview where Zoe was asked to delve into her feelings about her birth parents and her time in the foster system. As the cameras rolled, Zoe found herself opening up in ways she never had before. "For a long time, I was angry," she admitted, her voice soft but steady. "At my parents for leaving me, at the system for failing me, at the world for being so cruel. But Max," she paused, Running her hand through the dog's soft fur, Max taught me how to trust again, how to love without fear. And Jake and Sarah, they showed me that family isn't just about blood. It's about choice, about people who choose to love you no matter what. By the end of the interview, there wasn't a dry eye on set. The interviewer, a seasoned journalist, had to take a moment to compose herself before thanking Zoe for her honesty. As summer drew to a close, the campaign was ready to launch. Zoe's story was featured in magazines, on billboards, and in a touching television commercial that highlighted the transformative power of the human-animal bond. The response was overwhelming. Letters and emails poured in from people all over the country who had been touched by Zoe and Max's story. There were messages from other foster children who saw hope in Zoe's journey, from parents inspired to consider adoption, and from countless individuals moved to explore therapy dog work. One letter, in particular, stood out to Zoe. It was from a girl named Lily, who wrote about how she had been struggling with depression until she saw Zoe's commercial. Inspired by the story, Lily had volunteered at her local animal shelter and ended up adopting a dog of her own. "You and Max showed me that it's possible to find hope in the darkest places," Lily wrote. "Thank you for sharing your story. You've changed my life." Reading Lily's letter, Zoe felt a profound sense of purpose wash over her. This was why she had agreed to share her story, to give hope to others who might be where she once was. As the campaign gained momentum, new opportunities arose. Zoe was invited to speak at conferences about therapy dog work and youth empowerment. She and Max made appearances at schools, talking to students about resilience and the importance of compassion, both for animals and for each other. Through it all, Jake and Sarah remained a constant source of support, pride radiating from them at every turn. They helped Zoe navigate the newfound attention, always ensuring that her well-being and education remained the top priorities. One evening, after a particularly impactful school visit, Zoe found herself sitting on the porch steps with Jake, reminiscing about how far they'd come. "Did you ever imagine it would turn out like this?" Zoe asked, gesturing vaguely at the world around them. "When you first met me and Max, Jake chuckled, shaking his head. "Honestly? No. I knew you were special, both of you. But this?" He paused, his eyes growing serious. "Zoe, you've exceeded every expectation. You've turned your pain into purpose, your struggles into strength. You're changing lives, kiddo, including ours." Zoe leaned into Jake's side, a warmth spreading through her chest at his words. "We did it together," she said softly. "You, Sarah, Max, you gave me the chance to become who I was meant to be." As they sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set on another day, Zoe reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From a scared, lonely girl on the streets to a confident young woman with a loving family and a mission to help others. It was a transformation she could scarcely have imagined. Yet here she was, living proof that sometimes the simple act of kindness, saving a stray dog, offering hope to a lost child, could set in motion a chain of events that could change the world in the most profound ways. As the stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, Zoe felt a deep sense of gratitude and purpose settle over her. The road ahead was bright with promise, filled with opportunities to spread the love and hope she had been given to others who needed it most. The story of the orphan girl who saved the dog had blossomed into something far greater than Zoe could have ever dreamed. In saving Max, she had saved herself, and in the process, discovered the true power of compassion, resilience, and the unbreakable bond between humans and animals. As Max padded over to rest his head on her lap, Zoe smiled, running her fingers through his soft fur. "We did it, boy," she whispered. "We found our way home." As Zoe entered her senior year of high school, she found herself at a crossroads. The therapy dog program she and Max had helped popularize had grown beyond their wildest dreams. With chapters springing up in cities across the country, her speaking engagements and advocacy work had opened doors she never thought possible. But with college applications looming, Zoe faced a decision that would shape the next chapter of her life. One crisp autumn evening, Zoe sat at the kitchen table, surrounded by college brochures and application forms. Max lay at her feet, a constant, comforting presence. Sarah entered, carrying 2 mugs of steaming tea. "How's it going, sweetheart?" Sarah asked, setting one mug in front of Zoe. Zoe sighed, running a hand through her hair. "I don't know, Mom. There are so many options, so many paths I could take. How do I choose?" Sarah sat down, her eyes full of understanding. "It's a big decision, no doubt about it. But remember, there's no wrong choice here. Whatever path you choose, we'll support you." Zoe nodded, grateful for the reassurance. "I know. It's just, part of me wants to go to veterinary school to build on everything I've learned with Max and the therapy program. But another part of me feels drawn to social work, to help kids who are in the same situation I was." "Those both sound like wonderful options," Sarah said encouragingly. "Have you talked to your father about this? You know, he always has an interesting perspective." As if on cue, Jake's voice called from the doorway. "Did I hear my name?" He entered the kitchen, immediately assessing the scene before him. "Ah, the great college debate continues. I see." Zoe looked up at her father, a mixture of frustration and hope in her eyes. "Dad, how did you know what you wanted to do with your life?" Jake pulled up a chair, his expression thoughtful. "Well, kiddo, the truth is, I didn't. Not at first, anyway." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "You know, before I started working with dogs, I was on a completely different path. I was in finance. Believe it or not." Zoe's eyes widened in surprise. This was a part of Jake's history she hadn't heard before. Jake continued, "I was good at it, made decent money, but I wasn't fulfilled. It wasn't until I volunteered at an animal shelter one weekend that I found my true calling." "Sometimes, Zoe, your path finds you when you least expect it." Zoe pondered his words, absently scratching Max behind the ears. "So, you're saying I shouldn't worry too much about choosing the perfect major right now?" Jake nodded. "Exactly. Choose something you're passionate about, something that challenges you, but remain open to the unexpected turns life might take. Who knows? You might end up combining your love for animals and your desire to help kids in a way we can't even imagine yet." As Jake spoke, an idea began to form in Zoe's mind. "What if," she started, her voice gaining excitement, "what if I majored in psychology with a focus on animal-assisted therapy? I could work on developing programs that use therapy animals to help kids in the foster system or those dealing with trauma." Sarah's face lit up. "That sounds wonderful, Zoe. It would be a perfect blend of your experiences and passions." Jake beamed with pride. "See? You already have the answer inside you. You just needed to give yourself the space to find it." Energized by this new direction, Zoe threw herself into her college applications with renewed vigor. She crafted essays that spoke of her journey from the streets to becoming an advocate for animal-assisted therapy, weaving in her experiences with Max and the impact they'd had on countless lives. As the acceptance letters began to roll in, Zoe found herself with options she never dreamed possible. Universities were impressed not only by her academic achievements, but by the real-world impact she had already made. Several even offered her scholarships, recognizing the unique perspective she would bring to their programs. The day Zoe made her final decision was one of mixed emotions. She had chosen a university known for its innovative psychology program and its openness to interdisciplinary studies. It was an exciting opportunity, but it also meant leaving home for the first time since finding her place with the Thompsons. As Zoe sat on the porch steps, processing her decision, Max nudged his head under her hand, sensing her conflicting emotions. "It's a big step, huh, boy?" Zoe murmured, scratching behind his ears. "But don't worry, I'm not leaving you behind. We're partners, remember?" Indeed, arrangements had already been made for Max to join Zoe at college as a certified therapy dog. He would live with her in pet-friendly housing and continue their work together, while also helping Zoe research the effects of animal-assisted therapy on college students' mental health. The summer before college was a whirlwind of preparation and goodbyes. Zoe made sure to visit the hospital one last time, saying farewell to the staff and patients who had become like a second family. Sophie, now cancer-free and thriving, made a special trip to see Zoe off. "You're going to change the world, you know," Sophie said, hugging Zoe tightly. You already have, for so many of us. Zoe felt tears prick at her eyes. I'm going to miss you, she said softly. Sophie pulled back, a mischievous glint in her eye. Oh, you're not getting rid of me that easily. I expect regular updates on all your college adventures. As the day of departure drew near, Zoe found herself reflecting on the incredible journey that had led her to this point. She thought of the scared, lonely girl she had been, scrounging for survival on the streets. How could that girl have ever imagined she'd be here, preparing to leave for college with a loving family behind her and a bright future ahead? The night before she was set to leave, Zoe couldn't sleep. She tiptoed downstairs, finding Jake sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in hand. Couldn't sleep either, huh? He said, gesturing for her to join him. Zoe sat down, accepting the mug of hot chocolate Jake prepared for her. I'm excited, but I'm scared too, she admitted. What if I'm not ready? Jake reached across the table, taking her hand in his. Zoe, look at me. When she met his gaze, he continued, you are more than ready. You've faced challenges that would break most people, and you've come out stronger. You've turned your pain into purpose, your struggles into strength. College? That's just your next adventure. Zoe felt tears welling up in her eyes. I couldn't have done any of it without you and Mom. And Max, of course. Jake smiled, his own eyes glistening. We may have provided the opportunity, but you, Zoe Thompson, you're the one who seized it. Your strength, your compassion, your determination. That's all you. We're just blessed to be part of your journey. The next morning, as Zoe loaded the last of her belongings into the car, she took a moment to look at the house that had become her home. Sarah and Jake stood on the porch, trying and failing to hide their tears. Max sat at attention, ready for the new adventure. As Zoe hugged her parents goodbye, she felt a swell of emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. Thank you, she whispered, the words carrying the weight of all they had done for her. For everything? Sarah cupped Zoe's face in her hands. No, thank you, sweetheart, for showing us the true meaning of family, of resilience, of love, Jake added, his voice gruff with emotion. You go show the world what you're made of, kiddo. But remember, no matter where life takes you, you'll always have a home here. As Zoe drove away, Max's head resting on her lap, she felt a mix of excitement and nostalgia wash over her. The road ahead was full of promise and possibility, but she knew that the lessons she had learned about love, compassion, and the unbreakable bond between humans and animals would guide her every step of the way. The story of the orphan girl who saved a dog had evolved into something far greater than Zoe could have ever imagined. It had become a testament to the power of second chances, to the healing force of unconditional love, and to the profound impact one act of kindness could have on the world. As the familiar streets of her neighborhood faded in the rearview mirror, Zoe smiled, ready to embrace the next chapter of her journey. She had once been lost, but in saving Max, she had found herself. And now, together, they were setting out to change the world, one wagging tail and healing heart at a time. The open road stretched out before them, a metaphor for the endless possibilities that awaited. Zoe Thompson, once a lonely orphan, now a beacon of hope and resilience, was ready to write the next chapter of her extraordinary story. And with Max by her side, she knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, bound by a love that had the power to transform lives and inspire generations to come. If you enjoyed this story, we'd love for you to support us by leaving a like and subscribing to our Slices of Life channel. We'd also love to hear from you in the comments. Which city are you talking about? It's very rewarding for us to provide our followers with an enjoyable moment. We appreciate the unconditional support you show us in every story. Blessings!